hot yoga versus non-hot yoga? Is it just because we're turning on the heat? Well, that's an obvious difference. Well, we're going to talk about the difference between hot yoga and non-hot yoga, but before we do that, I want to define what hot yoga actually means and what do I mean when I'm talking about non-hot yoga. Recently, USA Today did an article on yoga, and they didn't say what's the difference between hot yoga and non-hot yoga. They said what's the difference between hot yoga and regular yoga, which drives me nuts because there's no such thing as regular yoga.
There's no such thing.
You have to think of yoga in specific styles. There's no such thing as a regular yoga or one universal type of yoga. Now, you can say what are the most popular styles, and that's what I want to talk about. That's what I want to address. So when I'm saying non-hot yoga, actually, I think I'm going to write an article to USA Today as a rebuttal. My wife is telling me to do that. So let's talk about what I mean by non-hot yoga, because there's so many there's more non-hot yoga styles than there are hot yoga styles. So when I'm talking about non-hot yoga, I'm going to talk about one of the most popular styles of yoga in the West. And when I say the West, everywhere outside of India, Australia, United States. So when I say non-hot yoga, I'm talking about the Krishnamacharyans. Krishnamacharya, arguably the most popular hatha yoga teacher of our time. He lived till he was 101 years old. He had three main students. One was Iyengar. So you can see where I'm going. Iyengar yoga. His second very popular student was Pattabhi Jois, who created his version of Ashtanga yoga. And then his son Deskachar, who created a style of yoga called Vinyasa. But many of the Western yogis who are famous, who are what I call the marquee teachers, Rodney Yee, Sean Korn, Shiva Ray, John Friend, Richard Freeman, Angela Farmer, they come underneath this umbrella of Krishnamacharyans, which I consider to be called non-hot yoga. This is arguably the most popular type of yoga that I'm talking about when I'm saying non-hot yoga. Now, before I start telling you about the main differences between hot yoga and non-hot yoga, I want you to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. Any comments or questions, things you might have heard differently, put them down below. I get to all the questions. You want to learn all about hot yoga, factoids and flows, make sure to hit the subscribe button now. So from here on in, when I'm talking about non-hot yoga, I'm talking about the Krishnamacharyans. Now let's talk about what I believe to be called hot yoga. It's not just because we turn on the heat. You can do any style of yoga and you turn on the heat, you're doing yoga in a heated room. When I'm talking about hot yoga, I'm talking about a particular style of yoga that was created by another very, very popular hatha yoga teacher of our time, Vishnu Ghosh. Vishnu Ghosh's older brother and guru, interestingly enough, was Paramahansa Yogananda, arguably one of the greatest gurus that ever came to the United States from India. This is how the Beatles got into yoga because of his book, Autobiography of a Yogi. Steve Jobs, it was the only book he had on his iPhone when he died, was Autobiography of a Yogi. So it comes from a very spiritual-based foundation. But Vishnu Ghosh had a different calling. Vishnu Ghosh was, when he was young, he took ill, and his brother, Paramahansa Yogananda, prescribed to him a series of postures. He had this miraculous healing in his body that he decided to dedicate his life to helping people heal through the practice of yoga, through the practice of the yogic asana. Now, back to that article on USA Today, they said that heating the room has nothing to do with the spirituality of yoga. They were making it wrong. Well, the spirituality has nothing to do with the heat or with the heat. It really depends on your intention. You can be practicing yoga without heat, and if your intention is just to get more flexible, it has nothing to do with spirituality either. So to say that spirituality and heat don't go hand in hand, that's sort of preposterous.
That's preposterous.
It's really about what your intention is while you're doing these postures. If your intention is to evolve spiritually, it doesn't matter if the heat's on or if it's not on, just a ridiculous thing to say. Back to Vishnu Ghosh. So he had a different calling than his brother, Paramahansa Yogananda, and all of his gurus before him, Babaji, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, to Paramahansa Yogananda. This was a lineage that practiced the spiritual side, a pranayama, spinal pranayama technique called Kriya Yoga. Vishnu Ghosh had a different calling. He was not professed to be an enlightened master. He took these yogic asanas based on his experience when he was younger to help heal people. So people would come to his college, he called it Ghosh's College of India in Calcutta, still there today. And people would come in not because they wanted to gain more spirituality, not because they wanted to get more flexible and stronger. I mean, maybe some did, but they came because they had some type of injury. Instead of going to the chiropractor or the acupuncturist or the physical therapist, they went to Ghosh's College of India to Vishnu Ghosh to help heal the body. So the origin behind this particular yoga was a healing modality. Use the postures, asanas specifically, to heal the body. And in Calcutta, it was just naturally hot. open the window and it's 100 degrees outside or 40 degrees Celsius with 100% humidity, but they really didn't turn the heat on. The first person to turn the heat on was one of Vishnu Ghosh's top students, Bikram Chowdhury. Back in India, when he closed the windows and it got even hotter in the room, he found he got deeper into the practice. Students of Vishnu Ghosh complained to Vishnu Ghosh that Bikram was closing the windows and it was too hot. But that's what got Bikram thinking, I like the hotter environment because it gets the muscles more pliable, more open. Bikram used to say, if you take a metal to a blacksmith, you saw him, you want a sword or a knife, the first thing the blacksmith's going to do is stick it in the fire. Because if you start to bang onto the cold piece of steel, you're going to break your hammer. But when the steel is heated up, you can mold it into any place you want. And then the heat really became a big factor when Bikram went to Japan. Vishnu Ghosh had a big affinity to the Japanese people in the country of Japan. So he sent Bikram there to teach yoga. So when he went to Japan, specifically Tokyo, it was freezing cold, much colder than it was in Calcutta. So he started putting on heat lamps to heat the room. And that's when he got the idea, and he kept that with him. And that's when this whole concept of heating the room came about. It was more from Bikram representing Vishnu Ghosh's style of yoga. So when I'm saying hot yoga, I'm talking about Vishnu Ghosh and Bikram, and the two together influenced this particular style. Now, that's not a difference. I'm not saying that the non-hot, the Krishnamacharyan asana practice doesn't help to heal the body. It does, of course. So it's definitely a similarity, not a difference. And as this yoga migrated to the West, that's one of the reasons why, especially in the United States, we gravitated to this particular type of exercise, because it was different than aerobics. It wasn't pounding. It was the extension of the body. It felt healthier to move and to stretch the body, not jarring it. So let's talk about differences. One main difference, beside heating the room, of course we know heating the room is a difference, but one main difference beside heating the room is alignment concepts. One very different alignment concept in the hot yoga world is the rounding of the spine. You're not going to see postures like rabbit pose, standing head to knee, standing separate leg head to knee. In the non-hot yoga world, they like long extended spines, so they don't really round. Maybe on occasion they may do a little bit of a rounding forward, like in this particular pose where they're stretching their backs of the legs, what we call Paschimottanasana. And interesting enough, when we do Paschimottanasana, we're in a straight back. We're not rounding forward. We're trying to touch our head to the feet, our head to the toes. So that's really an interesting dichotomy. We don't round in Paschimottanasana. They have a little bit of a rounding spine, but they don't exaggerate the rounded rabbit spine like we do. That's difference number one. Also, our yoga comes from a different region of India. It comes from the northeastern part of the country, the state of Bengal, specifically the city of Calcutta, where the Krishnamacharyans come down in Mysore, which is further south. Now in Mysore, that's when they start to adapt two particular poses that we don't do in our particular lineage, upward dog and downward dog. Urdhva Mukha Svanasana, Adho Mukha Svanasana, and that's really the transition that they do for the Vinyasa. According to Desikachar, who was the son of Krishnamacharya, he said that Krishnamacharya's main intention in asana was Vinyasa. Now in the Barkan method, as a side note, I loved upward dog, downward dog, and I incorporated that into the Barkan method, and we do a Vinyasa class with upward dog and downward dog, but postures from our lineage. I did a video a while back called Hot Vinyasa. You may want to watch that video after this one. But upward dog, downward dog comes from the south, not from the north, another big difference. Now back to number two, alignment-wise. Also, some postures we do have different alignment concepts, like the triangle pose. We have a right angle. We keep our extended leg bent, where in the Krishnamacharyan world, they do a straight leg triangle. So sometimes, same name for a posture with a different type of alignment, like the triangle pose. Now here's a big one. Here's a big difference. In the hot yoga world, we use full-length mirrors. We use mirrors on the front. Sometimes we use mirrors on the side. The side mirrors are more for the teacher, so the teacher can watch from the side mirror. As a practitioner, you don't want to be peeking over to the side unless you're a little more advanced. In fact, one of my advanced tips in the standing bow pose, take a look in the side mirror if you can hold your balance. Check out this video, I talk all about it. But we use mirrors, full-length mirrors. Now, why do we do that? Well, Vishnu Ghosh's influence also was on bodybuilding and weight training, interesting enough. He combined the two together. He just didn't practice asana. His gymnasium, they did wrestling, track, gymnastics, and bodybuilding. So bodybuilding and weightlifting, they look at mirrors to see the symmetry of their body. And what Vishnu Ghosh did was, in the yoga class, you can now check out your alignment, make your own corrections. You can make very subtle corrections. A posture like eagle pose, for example, you can look in the mirror and see that one shoulder's too high, bring it down. It's easier to bring the higher shoulder down. You can see one hip's too low in eagle pose. Bring the lower hip up. It's easier to bring the lower hip up. So we can make subtle adjustments in our own practice as students. It's definitely something you want to be doing in your own practice. Take a look in the mirror, make your own adjustments, get yourself set. Now let's talk about one very important similarity between the non-hot yoga, the Krishnamacharyans and Vishnu Ghosh, Bikram in the hot yoga world. And that was their influence initially. So Krishnamacharya, when he had his studio down in the south of India, it was adjacent to a gymnasium. And he would watch the gymnastics. And he was very influenced by the gymnastics. And a lot of the jump throughs and the jump backs and the arm balancings were influenced by gymnastics. So here's the cool similarity. Vishnu Ghosh taught gymnastics, and he had this one teacher, Bikram, forgot his name, I don't know what the guy's name was, that taught him modern athletics, bodybuilding and gymnastics and wrestling, and he used gymnastics as an influence for his style of yoga. So now, the Krishnamacharyans, let's talk about Iyengar and Ashtanga and the Vinyasa styles that came out of it, and in the Bikram world in hot yoga, arguably the most popular styles of yoga, and why as Westerners, United States, Europe, Canada, Australia. Why did we gravitate to this particular style of yoga? Because it was more similar to the way we exercise. It incorporated modern athletics with traditional way of doing asana. If we even know there's such a thing, we can find that out. Because the practice of asana originally was more seated poses and floor poses. And the yoga historians will tell you they didn't even call the standing poses postures until about 100 years ago. And most likely because of Krishnamacharya and Vishnu Ghosh, because they incorporated this whole new style of practicing the asana. I remember seeing back in the 50s on television. I didn't see it back then because I was too young, but I remember seeing a clip of it. The Chinese acrobats came on television and they started doing all their Chinese acrobatic motions, and it was almost exactly like Vishnu Ghosh's advanced class. It freaked me out. They were doing exactly the same things we were doing. It was so similar because we were influenced by that style, and that's what took off to the West. And now when we practice asana, we are also practicing for physical fitness. We're practicing to get stronger. We're practicing to get more flexible. And then eventually we lose stress. So there's the mental part of it. That's a very interesting, similar foundation between their two concepts of practicing the yogic asana. Here's another difference. The names of postures, not all of them, but sometimes we will have the same name for a different posture, or we will have the same posture with a different name. What we call wheel pose or chakrasana, chakra means wheel, Krishnamacharyans call Urdhva Dhanurasana or bow pose. What we call full tortoise, Purnakarmasana. The Krishnamacharyans have a completely different pose for that. They call this pose full tortoise, Purnakarmasana. That pose we call Mandukasana or frog pose. They call this posture Mandukasana or frog pose. So the point I want to make is that there's no one universal way of naming the pose. It really depends on where it comes from in India. I remember one of my students did a class once from a Krishnamacharyan class, and he said, okay, let's all do Urdhva Dhanurasana, which is upper bow, what we call chakrasana. My student didn't know what Urdhva Dhanurasana was, but I also teach the Sanskrit, so they knew Dhanurasana was bow, so they started doing floor bow pose. The teacher came over and said, you know what, as yoga teachers, you should all know the Sanskrit to the name of the poses. Well, that's not how we call it. We come from a different style of yoga than you do. Don't assume that your style is the universal style and everybody knows what it is. Unless they're coming to your studio and that's what you're teaching, then that's different. Then they're going to know what it is. But if you're teaching a class with different types of people, let's say in a conference, there may be different styles of yoga represented, so then therefore you have to address that. And it's interesting to see, and I did a video on this a few months ago called What's Wrong with Yoga Today? And one of the things that's wrong is that our judgment. Sometimes we make such judgment about the other styles of yoga because it's different. We're not used to it. That's where prejudice comes in. It's something we prejudge because it's something that's unfamiliar to us. I really started to understand the Krishnamacharyan lineage when I started doing yoga conferences and representing Bikram on the Yoga Journal Conference, Omega Conference, Johnny Kess did a conference up in Michigan. So I was introduced to a lot of the top Krishnamacharyan teachers, and I found that the top guys were actually fascinated by the differences. It was the students that developed the judgment. So it's amazing to see how judgmental people are about the way we do yoga in the hot yoga world and vice versa. So non-judgmentalness is just as much a part of the yogic integrity as doing postures in the proper alignment or calling a pose in the proper name, at least what you think the proper name may be. So can we let go of our judgment and just say, if you don't want to do that yoga, you don't want to turn the heat, then don't do it. I mean, why make it wrong? So one of the main points I want to make in this video is not just turning on the heat, understanding the difference between and embracing the difference between different styles of yoga. Find yoga that you gravitate to. Bikram used to say, jack of all trades, master of none. If you're doing yoga 6 times a week, don't do a different style every single day. First, search to see which one touches your heart, and that's the one you want to gravitate to. And then eventually you may want to branch out. The Tao says to be born in the church is wonderful, to die in the church you haven't listened to your heart. So exploring other types of yoga can be an extraordinary thing. And how to move your body in grace, and build flexibility, build strength, possibly have a spiritual intention behind your asana practice. Get rid of stress, physical, mental, spiritual connections. Asana practice is amazing no matter what style you're doing. Let's get rid of our judgment and let's find that union, which is what yoga is all about, and connect together. So that's our episode for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Hit the like button. Any comments, questions, put them down below. I get to all the comments, and I will see you the next video. Bye, everyone.